This doctor was confronted with what happens after death. But when he tried to tell people the truth, he was silenced. He was convinced that beyond life, there is only emptiness. But the stories of hundreds of patients who had survived a near-death experience fundamentally changed his view of life and what comes after. Some spoke of a radiant light pulling them forward, others of complete darkness filled with fear and despair. The most disturbing part was that their accounts matched, as if they had truly seen the other side. Cardiologist Michael Sabom dedicated 5 years of his life to these reports, and the conclusions he reached are shocking. Why then is his work being suppressed? He realized that his discoveries could fundamentally change our understanding of death. And the most important question remains, what is still being kept from us? In this report, we will uncover what this doctor was really hiding and why his findings challenge reality. In the year 1976, Sabom was invited to a popular television show. At that time, society was practically obsessed with the accounts of those who had survived a near-death experience. Newspapers were full of such stories. Books about life after death sold millions of copies, and near-death experiences were being discussed everywhere. But Michael Sabom remained loyal to science and regarded all this excitement with skepticism. For him, as a doctor, life after death was nothing more than a myth, and the patient's accounts were merely dreams, hallucinations, or perception errors triggered by shock or lack of oxygen in the brain. When he took part in the show, he firmly decided to use this opportunity to debunk popular myths. Sabom had no intention of pandering to sensationalism. His goal was to prove all these accounts are merely psychological mechanisms that can be scientifically explained. So he decided to conduct his own study among patients who had survived cardiac arrest and narrowly escaped death. He wanted to collect as many of their stories as possible, analyze them carefully, and find patterns that would confirm his thesis that these were mere illusions. Sabom was convinced he could close this case. But the deeper he delved into the subject, the more his faith in his original assumption faded. One day, during a conversation with yet another patient, his counterpart looked at him attentively and calmly said, "You won't believe me anyway." At that moment, Sabom was overcome by a strange feeling, a premonition that the most incredible part was still ahead. Michael Sabom began his study in May of the year 1976, while working at a hospital in Florida. It was an ordinary day, like hundreds before. He walked through the corridors, peeked into the patient rooms, and checked on their conditions. At first glance, the routine duties of a doctor. But something bigger was already growing inside Sabom. The urge to research and the desire to get to the bottom of the truth. He wasn't just performing routine checkups. He was specifically looking for those who had once stared death in the face. At first, he asked his questions cautiously, then became increasingly persistent, trying to grasp the essence of what these people had experienced. In every account, he sensed something significant that could help explain their strange visions. The first person to openly share his story with him was a 50-year-old village watchman who had survived a heart attack in the year 1973. He was a sturdy man with hands marked by hard labor. Sabom expected to hear something vague, fragments of memories, incomplete images, perhaps something resembling a dream. But the report he received was so clear and detailed that it knocked the ground out from under the doctor. The watchman remembered everything down to the smallest detail. He recounted how he felt a sharp pain in his chest, clutched it, collapsed to the ground, and lost consciousness. But the strangest part happened afterward. He saw himself from the outside, lying on the cold tiled floor, exactly in the position where the heart attack had struck him. 3 paramedics rushed over, bent over him, discussed briefly, carefully lifted him onto a stretcher, and took him to the emergency room. He not only remembered it, he observed the scene from above, as if floating above his body, as if he had been transported to another dimension. What amazed him most were the details he would never have noticed in everyday life. For the first time, he realized that the floor in the hospital corridor was made of black and white tiles, although he had walked over it dozens of times without ever noticing the pattern. When he was brought into the operating room, he saw the doctor who was supposed to save him But instead of relief, he felt unease. Everything around him felt strange, cold, and threatening. He described it as a nightmare where a familiar place suddenly becomes eerie. Sabom listened carefully, but the doubt wouldn't leave him. In his mind, he tried to rationalize the story. Surely, the watchman had seen something like this on television before or had heard sound while being transported through the hospital corridors and subconsciously filled in the scene in his imagination. Finally, Sabom couldn't hold back and asked directly, "Have you perhaps seen something like this before? Maybe in a movie?" The watchman just shook his head and replied with a smile, "If there was something like that, I would definitely have watched it." After this conversation, Sabom couldn't leave the topic alone. He continued meeting with patients, noting their memories, and with each new report, he realized these stories were strikingly similar. Strangers who had never met before described the same sensations, floating above their own body, watching the doctors, and noticing details they could never have registered in a normal state. These were not vague fantasies or confused hallucinations. They were clear and precise memories. For Sabom, a convinced skeptic, this became a real challenge. He began to realize either all these people had somehow conspired, which was highly unlikely, or they had encountered something that defied known scientific understanding. After hearing dozens of such stories, Michael Sabom recognized a pattern. Most patients did not describe the state of clinical death as something frightening, but rather as a bright, inspiring experience. They spoke of deep peace, a sense of freedom, and the realization that death is not an end, but rather a transition into something unknown and by no means something terrible. One of the patients, a 45-year-old man, recalled, "I knew I had died, but I felt no fear at all. On the contrary, I felt an incredible lightness and calm, as if a heavy burden I had carried my whole life, without even realizing it, was suddenly lifted from me. If death really is like that, then there is nothing to be afraid of." Sabom was not only impressed by the story itself, but also by the calmness and certainty with which the patient spoke about it. The doctor had expected to hear fear, panic, or horror at the realization of death. But instead, sitting before him was a man who described the experience as one of the brightest moments of his life. And this case was by no means unique. Many patients reported a feeling of peace and a bright light that could not be described in words. This light did not blind them. On the contrary, it warmed them and gave a feeling of security and calm. Some heard kind voices full of love. These voices did not speak words in the conventional sense, but everyone instantly understood their meaning, as if the message was transmitted directly into their consciousness, triggering inspiration and warmth. But there were also other stories. A 16-year-old girl had a near-death experience after a car accident. She remembered seeing a light and hearing a voice, but when she gathered all her courage and told the doctor, he merely responded with indifference. "No, I don't believe that." Not a spark of interest or empathy. When she told her parents, their reaction was even colder. Instead of offering support, they took her to a psychiatrist who immediately stated that it was nothing more than hallucinations caused by shock and trauma. He convinced her that her experience was meaningless and merely a product of her imagination. This diagnosis ended the conversation. The girl remained silent about it for 23 years. Throughout all this time, she told no one about her experience. Yet the memory stayed alive within her, did not fade, did not dissolve like a dream. On the contrary, it became clearer and more vivid with the years. When she finally told Michael Sabom about it many years later, she did so with relief, but there was still a certain fear in her eyes, as if she expected that he too would dismiss her story. But Sabom did not make a diagnosis or brush aside her words. He understood. This was no fantasy or figment of imagination. Society is not accustomed to taking such experiences seriously. They are often dismissed or explained away with familiar scientific theories. But if such vivid and similar memories arise in so many different people, could it be that we simply know much less about death than we think? However, not all near-death experiences were marked by light and peace. Some patients reported completely opposite experiences, unsettling and cold, with clear feelings of fear and loneliness. These stories challenged the familiar image of death as something gentle. If death is supposedly a transition into something bright and good, why did so many only see emptiness and endless darkness, feeling the loss of their own self? One woman reported that after complications during surgery, everything around her suddenly disappeared: sounds, images, even the perception of her own body. Only boundless darkness remained. In this darkness, she felt her consciousness racing forward at incredible speed, as if she were falling into a bottomless abyss. She tried to grab onto something, to find support, to understand where she was, but she felt neither a floor beneath her nor any boundaries. I was completely alone, she recalled. No one, nothing, just an emptiness that seemed to close in on me from all sides. With each passing second, she felt her strength fading, but the scariest part was the uncertainty of whether it would ever end. A similar case happened to an older man who had suffered a heart attack. After his heart stopped, he saw no light, no calming images. Instead, he found himself in total darkness, without a single sound or any movement. I didn't know where I was. This place was terrifyingly empty, without borders, without a sense of time. I felt invisible walls closing in around me and crushing me, while I raced somewhere at great speed without knowing where. The longer it lasted, the greater the fear became, he said. These accounts made Michael Sabom reflect deeply. Why did some people describe their near-death experiences as bright and relieving, while for others they turned into a nightmare? Was it a reflection of their personal fears at the moment of dying, or were other, still unknown factors at play, determining the type of experience? Some theories suggested that perception depended on individual beliefs. People who believed in goodness and an afterlife might see light and peace, while those who saw death as an absolute end might encounter complete emptiness. But Sabom was not satisfied with this explanation. Too many questions remained unanswered. There were also other hypotheses. Perhaps the experience depended on the phase the person was in during clinical death, or on other factors yet to be discovered. After all, not everyone reached the next stage. Many were brought back to life beforehand. Maybe this darkness was something greater, something that went beyond the known physiological response of the brain, something that did not fit into the usual scientific explanations. With each new account, the questions became more numerous, and Sabom realized, the deeper he delved into this phenomenon, the harder it became to find a clear and definitive answer.